Hello and welcome to the latest first thing we've done on the Leading with Integrity podcast. It is the clip show, the revisit, the compilation album. So for Boxing Day this year, I hope you've all had a lovely Christmas yesterday, by the way, or if you don't do Christmas, then at least a nice quiet day. So this year I thought we'd try something a bit different. We're going to do a look back at some of the guests we've had this year, the highlights, if you will. And I'll confess this has taken me a long time to decide. I've done my best. Not every guest will be featured, and that is, of course, no poor reflection on any of the ones who have missed out. Some of them just didn't make it because I had to be ruthless. But anyway, so the ones that did, we've split them into some key themes that we saw come up time and again over the course of the year. And it's useful, I think, interesting, hopefully, to revisit those and just remind ourselves about some of the key lessons that we've talked about. So in short form, those categories are valuing people, equity, diversity and inclusion, what great leadership looks like from communication to tackling those big leadership myths, leadership lessons and stories from veterans and people who are or have served in the forces. Conflict and difficult relationships came up quite a bit in a workplace context. We'll also revisit the mini-series we had on burnout earlier this year. And then finally, a series of clips on one of the biggest recurring themes that comes up time and time again on the podcast, since day one, not just this year, as well as in leadership itself, it's always a hot button topic, and that is the future of work. So thanks for being with us. I hope you'll find it useful. And give me some feedback, throw a comment, drop us an email, send me a message on LinkedIn. Let me know what you think about this episode and whether it's worth doing it again at the end of next year.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast.
Leadership talk for the modern manager.
With your host, David Hatch.
Our first category of clip then, valuing your people, treating them with kindness, respect, empathy, recognizing that no leader succeeds alone, it takes a village. We are nothing without the teams around us. So some thoughts on that taken from quite a few episodes actually, including Matthew Pizon, Mike Cading, Anthony Lavopa, Emily and Alan Braithwaite, Juan Alvarado Jr., Sabine Gideon, Mandy Bowsmith and Sai Islam. And hopefully I've edited those clips in the same order as the names I've just said them. But yeah. If you had to choose one feature, one behaviour, let's say, that you would most associate with successful leadership, what would that be?
Working alongside your team so that they can see that you're a part of the team and you're not this supreme leader delegating from on high, being approachable and relatable to your folks and really rolling up your sleeves and working alongside them, not doing their job, not taking away from what they're doing, but showing them that you're engaged in what they're going through.
But here's the thing that most leaders fail to understand. And that is that the best people outperform the average by 2 to 5 to even 10 times as much. I've seen it so many times over. So instead, if you're looking at the cost per person, yeah, that's more expensive, but instead you should look at the cost per unit produced. And from that perspective, your best people are actually your least expensive. So for those who feel that they can't afford to hire the best, my response is simply, you can't afford not to.
Yes, I'm so with you there. It's a conversation that comes up so many times on this podcast. It's the same kind of dynamic as well around paying people what they're worth, paying them in accordance with the value they bring to your business. That's the only thing that matters. It doesn't, I don't care about what the prevailing market rate is for their job title. You pay for the result you want.
And arguably, if you're going to hire somebody and they're willing to walk through the door and say, hey, this is my background. This is what I've done. This is the skill set I have. How can I apply it? I think that's incredibly powerful to an organization to have the flexibility to say, hey, we can move this person around we could do what we need with this person, because they're willing to learn and be adaptable. I think when you kind of start trying to pigeonhole people into a particular role and then just kind of, put them in a box and you tell them stay in that box. I think that's some poor leadership and not allowing that person to be innovative and contribute to the rest of the team. But two, I think it makes that individual feel incredibly frustrated in terms of, well, this is the box. I have to stay in the box. And then I think they go from an employee that could be potentially excited with a lot of ability to add value to an employee that quickly becomes frustrated, disgruntled, and then kind of just turns inward and just, comes to work, does what they need to do, and then goes home.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially pertinent in the smaller businesses, the startups, the ones where sometimes the pace of change is rapid. And so they need that flexibility. But as you say, if you put someone in the box, then sooner or later they'll maliciously stay in that box,
Sure.
if you know what I mean. So when you need them to be flexible, they won't. And yeah, it's an interesting one. It reminds me of that truism about the perfect being the enemy of the good as well. We hear it a lot in terms of work and output and product, but I think it applies to your hiring as well. There's quite a few business leaders I've seen over the years as well, where they just hold out for that perfect candidate and surprisingly never find them.
The idea there of transferable skills and recognizing what those transferable skills are sooner as well. So Alan's great example there, those leadership skills from being in the mountains are absolutely true in a corporate environment as well. And you just you don't tend to sit back and reflect on what you have done previously as well, and those things that are transferable. And we've got in terms of our career paths, we've had those portfolio careers, lots of different things we've done, but they are transferable, and recognizing that just because you're going to apply for that job or that job, you should be remembering what you've done and all those other things that apply to that moment. Is
knowing how people want to receive feedback, for example. Because a lot of leadership theory would suggest the best way to do that is you praise in public and reprimand in private. And that's been the standard for ages, right? But actually, for a lot of people, that could be really embarrassing. They might be hugely introverted. They don't want to be praised in public. They just want someone to quietly, as part of building that relationship, just say to them, that was a really good job. Well done. Thanks for that. And that's all they want.
Yeah. And usually when I talk about recognition, I talk about 3 letters, TSI. Timely, specific, and individualized, right? So don't wait for your yearly evaluation to go tell somebody that they did a really good job. Don't wait until in 2 weeks we have our Christmas party. I'll tell them then. Do it now. Do it now. Like it needs to be done sooner than later. Specific is be specific. Stop saying good job, right? Because if I was to tell you after this, hey, good job on the podcast. What does that even mean? Hey, the way you answered those questions, or you allowed me to kind of interrupt and speak freely, asking me questions I've never gotten before, like you did a really good job in that. Like you made me feel comfortable. Way different and specific than good job, right? So be specific. And then individualized. Individualized is, and I don't know where it's like where you're from, but there's always 2 things that people get recognized with, like, hey, here's for you and your department, here's a pizza party, right? Or here's a Starbucks gift card. And I'm like, stop giving Starbucks gift cards. I would get tens, if not hundreds of Starbucks cards for doing a good job. And I do not drink coffee.
This is an identity shift. And every single person on your team, whether you're managing 1 people or 50 people, hopefully you're not a brand new manager managing 50 people. But, everyone is an individual, and having that mindset and an understanding doesn't mean that you have to contort yourself to support everyone, but you need to understand that John works like this. He's motivated by this. These are his drives. These are his needs. Susie is motivated by this. And to the extent that you can, if you can't support them, being able to direct them to the resources that they need.
One of the things that led me to open my own business in the space that I'm in is, I don't know about you, David, but a lot of people I talk to hate their human resources departments. And it bums me out. I mean, to be perfectly honest, it bums me out to hear how people perceive their human resources departments and some of the experiences that they share with me they've had. And one of the things that I would like to do is to put the human back in human resources, right? What is the number one asset any employer has? Their humans. And if we treat our humans poorly, that asset is either going to dwindle away or it's going to not perform the way we need it to. And so for me, putting the human back in human resources also sort of informs my leadership philosophy, which is trying to put humanity back in leadership.
I can't remember his name either, but he was on LinkedIn a couple of years ago and made a lot of noise, made a big splash about it. He put everyone in the company on the same salary. I think they were all taking like 70K.
Yeah,
that's you probably know
Dan
who it
Price,
is.
I think is his name.
That's the guy. Yeah. And that felt, I don't know. I'd love to know what's happened since then, because that was a few years back. Like, is the business still going? Is everyone still paid the same? And how did it work? What difference did it make? Did turnover go up or down in terms of people? Or
I actually think his company is still pretty successful. He got into some personal issues, if I remember correctly. There was some, I think maybe Me Too type stuff for him personally that came out, which was unfortunate. But yeah, generally his idea of just, fairly compensating people like a little bit above market rate, and retaining employees and not just saying like, okay, we're going to go for the biggest profit of all time. That idea is, I think, very powerful. It's also true that in a lot of contexts, there are business practices that are engaged in that really don't lead to better business. So, for example, in the United States, we're seeing layoffs happen, but in general, layoffs they don't save money. They don't make the organization better. They're very much a short-term, like, P&L kind of win. So you're just, getting rid of staff, but every process within the organization suffers because you engage in that. And there's no data that shows that layoffs lead to overall better performance in the long run. But you can't meet a business executive that isn't ready to hit the layoff button at the drop of a hat.
And our second category, discussions of equity, diversity and inclusion. Why is it still a challenge? Where are companies going wrong? We'll also hear the lived experiences of some of this year's guests. So we've got clips from episodes with Libby Vincent, Jimmy Okavanjo, Raymond Lauk and Dr. Frank Douglas.
The challenge is not that there are not enough women in these roles. The challenge is that there are too many people which are thinking and behaving in similar ways in these roles. And that to bring diversity into that group, we are forced to measure by other things like color and age and gender. But it is a disservice to women to conceptualize all female leaders as belonging to the same bucket. There is, remember I said some academic papers have fabulous names. There's one called Heavier Lies Her Crown, and it's a meta-analysis. But it looks at the emotional labor which is placed upon women because of this expectation. And it is often unpaid. It's often undervalued. And for many women, it's not a natural sense that they want to care and look after for the organization. But so they feel it as an additional burden. But when you live in a society which devalues a group of behaviors, there was a psychologist referred to them as communal behaviors. When you devalue them socially, and these are things like collaboration, empathy, compromise, and you overvalue another group of behaviors, which are referred to as agentic. So these are the kind of top-down decision-making, directive, command and control behaviors. You promote those that demonstrate agentic behaviors, and you devalue those that don't. And the reason I use agentic and communal is because they are not attached to feminine and masculine in the way that they were in Victorian times when people were still having these conversations. So I would love to see more leaders generally demonstrating these communal skills of collaboration, compromise, dealing with ambiguity, leading through influence rather than authority. I think that we're seeing again and again how valuable these skills are. We live in a society where 50% has been socialized to behave more in this way than the other. But the opposite is true. For as many women that are adopting behaviors that they feel are necessary to be seen as appropriately feminine, there are men who are adopting behaviors because they are appropriately masculine. There is a self-harm and suicide epidemic for men in the UK who feel unable to show signs of weakness, to seek support. We see decisions being made in large organizations by men who are risking their own personal health because of the stress of the role that they're in, of their inability to delegate or to work with a wider leadership team, who are hospitalizing themselves because of the pressure they're putting on themselves to maintain a persona which we associate with leadership.
The documentary, we interviewed 3 women of color who worked in and around London. So we had stories from Kingston, from Kent, from Manchester, but their careers were all in London, and kind of what they faced and how they overcame the challenges with the reality of being a woman of color working in England in the 2020s, and also what they're doing now that makes them happy. And my hope is really for anyone who's really struggling with toxic work, whoever you may be, to understand that it's not just in your head. You're not just imagining it, but also to shine a light for employers and managers to begin to have better conversations about what does it really take to create a workplace where people can thrive and do their best work and also want to stay. But I began to hear a lot of the stories in terms of just how shocked people were by how I was not by how I was being treated, but the extent to which I was trying to figure out how I could work through it. The lot of horror, that's not something you're supposed to try to work through. That's something you're supposed to call the police about. Those kinds of things. And, but everything was like, no, I'll work through it. I'll figure it out. And so when we began to listen to stories of women in England, I began hearing a lot of the same kind of desperation, sadness, despair, frustration, anger, fear, confusion, bewilderment. And when I would talk about my story, people would ask me so what did you do to cause this? When they called you the N-word, or when they said they could have hired a white man for your job, when they threatened you, what were you doing that warranted someone to treat you that way? And I was like, and so once I'd explained, oh no, you didn't do anything. And I didn't want to keep on having to explain what happened or have to convince friends and family that I wasn't making up. No, I wasn't going to work drunk and mouthing off and letting out, infestation of spiders in the office. That wasn't what was causing it. I wasn't falling asleep to work. I was hitting my targets. I was exceeding my targets. That wasn't it. It just wasn't, performance was not the issue. And, I felt people say, well, once you've proven performance is an issue, then we'll look at race. If you can hit all the performance targets, then we know it's not a gender issue and a race issue. But what I found, David, is that every company has a Harold or a Gordon or Hermione, a cranky, cantankerous person, highly problematic, who is not performing. But they're allowed to be untouched and run riot. That's a little bit racist, a little bit sexist. And by little bit, I mean a lot bit. They're a little bit of a bully. They're a little bit of misogynist. They're a little bit threatening. They're a little bit horrible. They just make a couple people cry. Everyone knows they're a bit of a problem. We know these companies have these people. So companies can keep people in their space that are not performing.
And that's one of the interesting things that I'm learning about in my research, because I've got some superintendents who were administrators, or at least they were well into their careers in the 80s during the AIDS epidemic. And one of the people that I interviewed was fired just for being seen in a gay neighborhood. And of course, we've come a long ways from that. And not to get too far off the question, but I do remember my first principalship. I was hired on whatever day of the week it was, and the superintendent said, "Tonight you're going to come to the board meeting." And there were the other principals. We didn't know what we were doing in the closed session, which was, private from the public meeting. And this was in 1993. And the superintendent was shared with the board that we had one or more children in the school district with AIDS, not HIV positive, but with full-blown AIDS. And because of the confidentiality, no one could know who they were, which school they were in, which classroom they were in. So you can imagine at that time, again, still early 90s, there's this fear legitimately about AIDS and how it's getting transmitted and what can we do and how are we going to catch it and all that stuff. And you could have been a teacher with one of those children in your class and not know about it. But that was fine, because what we learned was it didn't matter, because you're not going to catch it in a school. We had all the training on universal practices, which was basically, if there's a body fluid, don't touch it. Well, guess what? We never would touch it anyway. I mean, we've been teachers, elementary teachers.
Why would you? Yeah.
With all sorts of body fluids. And the younger the kids are, the more the body fluids there are in a classroom. Yeah, sure, and we didn't need to be told, don't touch it. We weren't touching it anyway. But, over time, we kind of got over that fear. And so there were those superintendents that came up through that period. And then I'm seeing other groups of superintendents who, some will say, I'm a superintendent, period. Who I sleep with, what my personal life is irrelevant to my job. Then there are other superintendents who say, nonsense. I am a gay superintendent and I am an advocate for my LGBTQ students. And that's very much their sexual identity is very much tied to their professional identity as well. So,
which side of that debate would you fall on, do you think, if you were to do it again?
Yeah, good question. I would probably have been the advocate. And when I came out, so I came out in 2010. First, I came out to my family. And then the next question was, do I come out at work too? Because superintendency is a very political position. You start making decisions, and there's always somebody on the short end of the stick. On any decision you make, someone who's disagreeing with it. And so I first came out to my board, and I had a wonderful board president. She was a retired first grade teacher, just a lovely person, very supportive. She understood the role of the Board of Education, which is governance, and it's not running the schools. It's making sure that the schools are well run by the superintendent. But I called her up and I said, Lynn, I've got something to share with you. Do you mind coming in to the office when you've got a minute? So she did. And I told her, and I sat her down. I said, Lynn, just want you to know that I'm gay, and I came out to my family just over the holidays. And she said, oh, thank God. I said, well, it's an interesting response. What's that about? She said, I thought you were going to quit. so the gay thing was really nothing.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion became basically a slogan to encapsulate those laws and executive orders that focused on affirmative action and voting rights, civil rights, etc. That's what DEI is about. So I came to America at that time of tremendous social changes was the wrapping up also of the war in Vietnam. As I pointed to people is that what people don't realize in 1966, you had the demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. You had the Black Power movement ongoing. It was the birth of NOW, the National Organization of Women. So on many social fronts, things were happening in that time period, and I had a front row seat. And now to me, to see the changes that are going on in America, and the decisions being made by the Supreme Court, it is going back to a pre-1960s time that I find very difficult to understand. After so much progress, this violent lurch to the past, very strange to me and troubling.
I don't think you're alone in that. I mean, certainly from the outside, I mean, we're certainly in no position to throw stones in the UK either on a lot of these issues. But yeah, it does seem a bit bizarre. And I think a step backwards, I think, is the right way to describe it, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, that's politics, I suppose, fortunate as it may be.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting perspective you must have on that, having gone through the immigration experience as well and coming into the States at that time as an outsider, effectively, to start with. Did it occur to you at the time how meaningful this was going to be for the future?
Well, it was very vivid for me for two reasons. One, I was at the Cornell University, which was a politically very active campus. In fact, at Cornell University was the one campus in which Black students exited the student union, which they had taken over with guns. As they were told that they were students who had guns who were going to attack them when they exited. So they were able to get someone to supply them with guns. So they exited with guns. And there's this famous picture on Time magazine, from the cover of Time magazine, as these two students entered. I won't comment on what my own personal involvement was at that time, but just simply to say that, of course, I had a front row seat, and I was very sympathetic, because the one thing I told people is that for white Americans, I was Black. It had nothing to do. When I spoke and they heard an accent, some of them apologized and would say, "Well, no, I thought you were a Black American. We have nothing against you. It has to do with Black Americans." But there was the experience of being judged by the color of my skin. I was Black, period. Yeah, and so it's interesting for me, having lived through that and now seeing this, tremendous change, as I say, the lurch back to the past. It's
What does great leadership look like? This is a topic that's come up pretty much from episode 1 as well. So we'll be talking about this in the context of communication, authenticity, tackling leadership myths, and similar. It is an important subject because it's so crucial to know what we're aiming for as leaders. What does actually getting it right look like? So we've got clips from conversations over the course of this year with Ulrika Seminati, with Dave Bates, Drew Dudley, Summer Jelinek, and Rachel and Kieran McKenna more recently, who you may recognise from just last week's episodes.
But I think there's a big difference between being very, very selective on what you communicate and being just really more authentic also as a human being, and have that perspective. I communicate as a human, not as a CEO. Because first of all, that's what people see. They see a human. And if then you turn into this CEO persona, you create a huge barrier, and there is the disconnect. Even before you have said the first word. So there's a lot in the communication piece when it comes from senior leaders, be it on what they believe about themselves, the beliefs that they have about communications as such, the beliefs or the habits that they have when they communicate to the whole organization. There's so much into it that I think we need to see differently and break to a certain extent to reshape it from scratch on a more authentic level that can make such a difference then at the end.
there's a few things about it that have always kind of interested me, particularly about this sort of dynamic. I think the first is almost this kind of fear of sharing too much information and this assumption that if you tell people the full truth, it's going to disillusion them and they're going to leave your business.
A lot of people talk, this is a personal bee in my bonnet, so we'll be on a rabbit trail if you let me, and we'll come back off of it really quickly. A lot of people talk about communications as a soft skill. And they do that because they think hard skills are things you can learn in the classroom. They're things you can test for. Well, I have a degree in communications. It means I went to a classroom and I was tested on my understanding of the body of knowledge, right? So that can't be the test of whether there's a hard skill or a soft skill. And I laugh a lot. I say, for car people, you want to get in your car and you want to go from point A to point B. If I take the soft tires off, how will you get there? It doesn't matter how great your car is and how great the sheet metal is. Without the tires, you can't get there. And so I think in leadership and communications is a similar way. The communications are the tires that attach to the road that take your leadership skills from point A to point B.
A big part of my work is this idea that I'm not saying that everyone should be a CEO or president, because not everyone wants to, not everyone has the skills to do it. But there's a broader form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. And what I found is that when people talk about leadership, and more importantly, when they teach leadership, particularly to young people, that type of leadership is ignored. And the only type that is sort of broadcast or taught to people are the ones associated with titles and power and influence. And so for me, the type of leadership that's always been taught, I'm not saying it's not leadership. I'm saying it's a subsection of a broader concept, and we're not teaching the broader concept.
Many times especially when like we're working with new managers, I'll ask, why did you want to be a leader? And they're either it's a combination of I wanted more money, or they look like they don't really do anything all day and that seemed fun. And it's like, okay, well, let's start talking about the myths of leadership. And those two are pretty big myths that happen. And that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to come onto your podcast, is because that leadership, that leading with integrity is so critical, that understanding what leadership is, hopefully before you get into it. But then once you do get into it, really understanding that it's not an accurate representation from the outside looking in.
And you can almost feel the energy in the room as you're going through the workshops, as people start to realize, actually, my role is valuable, because sometimes and a lot of it is about positioning. And again, that motivation and that sort of realization of where do I fit in the company? And that for us, that's the bits I love, is kind of when people get that realization that their role is bigger than just an admin role.
The aha moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the... I hesitate to say it's one of the most important things a leader can do, because I say that all the time about loads of different things, but it is a really important thing a leader can do. I think it's also something that the bad leaders, the bad managers get wrong perhaps most often, is this sort of idea of just do the thing because I told you to, you don't need to know anything else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But actually that context is so important. Like if you want motivated, happy people, they need to understand why task X, Y, or Z, or why their whole job even matters to the whole business, what their contribution is to the customer, to the people that they're helping, to the bottom line even. Because if they understand that, then they know what they're working towards. They'll work harder, firstly, so all managers want that, right?
Yeah.
But also that if they understand it, then they can take initiative, they can innovate, they can be a bit more passionate about it all as well. And it just creates a better culture too.
And it's the old word, isn't it? Moving forward with purpose.
In the spring this year, I did a short mini-series where all of the episodes were interviews with veterans, particularly those who'd served in the US forces in various guises. There's some great leadership lessons to be had from high-stress environments like those, where precision, where trust is crucial. And there were also, without exception, really interesting conversations. I say that about every episode, but you get my gist. Anyway, today in this segment, we've got clips from my conversations with Will Yeski, with Derek Johnson, Anthony Lavopa again, Raymond Kemp Sr., and of course, George Dom.
So the biggest leadership lesson is you can't do it on your own. With anything, with any working team like we had over there, but translating even to creating a project like this book, I wouldn't have been able to do that without them. The publisher came out and was like, in the initial talks and everything, they're like, hey, can you supply us with 30 good high res pictures? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Not a problem. And what they didn't know is like, at the time I had, 5 grainy Facebook pictures and was like, all right, how am I going to do this? And that's really how it all, started coming down, is they put the accountability on me once they started showing up and once they started bringing stuff forward. Like, all of that stuff that you see on social from the last year, that was all them, like bringing it out and saying, hey, like, this is what I have, if it will help and it'll help bring the story forward, like, do it. Or the guys that I had to sit down and interview. There was a bunch of them to where I would not be able to get that picture. And I know for a lot of them, that's a tough thing for them to do, is sit down and open these traumas back up. And quite honestly, though, for all of us, it ended up being good for a lot of people. Not just me, in the way of slowing down enough to kind of really process some of this. I kind of noticed afterwards that, in writing some of this, there was some chapters where tears are just streaming, to where I'm like, where is this coming from? Because I've always been able to talk about it, but it was really slowing things down enough to really, I guess, come to terms with everything that had happened over there. And it was like, man, we share these burdens together, though. And, in doing so and in moving forward together and whatnot, I don't know, it's just been a really good experience.
The know-it-all, maybe they're good at what they do on paper, they're accomplished, but team building, communication skills, presentations, maybe they're not that great at those things because they're just like trying to rush through it. And I've noticed that the overly competitive person, they get annoyed with people that don't catch on as fast as they think they should. They're like, we've had 2 meetings about this. Why is this not done? It's like, hey, understandable. She learns differently. He learns differently. So the best leader, they can read everyone and then they can approach each person slightly different. You know what? Let's pull her aside before he embarrasses her in the meeting. Let's pull her aside and say, hey, what are you struggling with in the system, the program, whatever the workflow is? But I do believe the best leader has a hybrid. They can work with the team. They're self-aware. They're aware of their team, knowing how to approach each person. And then on the bad side, sometimes people that are overly competitive, they miss the other skills when they're just focused on competition.
It's interesting because, particularly in the context of the salesperson, so there's this quite well-established problem about the accidental manager, which is the example that is usually given is the salesperson who's promoted into sales manager, let's say, and ends up being absolutely terrible, even though they're a brilliant salesperson.
Oh yeah,
and I've never heard it linked to the competitiveness side of it before, but it makes a lot more sense.
I also tell people a lot that leadership is not a title; it's a mindset, right? You be in your first job, coming out of school or whatnot, and you're day one, and you may not have experience in that field, or you may not have tenure or time with that company or organization or team, but that doesn't mean you can't be a leader from day one. And so it's a mindset to me. It's not a title. And I think we've all been part of organizations where somebody was quote unquote the leader of a team, but in actuality, everybody on that team went to someone else for advice, feedback, whatever it may be. And then the person that was the actual designated leader was just the recipient of a product or a meeting or a briefing.
My mother had to sign for me to have permission to go, because in the United States, you have to be 18 for your signature to really to carry real weight. And because I wasn't 18 yet, my mother had to sign for me to go, and off I went. And who knew that 33 years would come out of an intentional desire to leave the town I was from and do something bigger.
Yeah, I mean, quite a story, definitely. I mean, President Biden then, so being appointed by the president, I mean, that's pretty impressive credential there. I mean, what was that like? Did you get to meet him, or was it a remote thing? Or
I tell you, I appreciate you asking that question. So an interesting thing about my career is that when I was born in the 60s, raised in the 70s, joined the Navy in the 80s. And so Ronald Reagan was the president when I joined the Navy. And I had the unusual opportunity to be in the environment, not necessarily shake everyone's hand, but be in the environment with every president from Ronald Reagan all the way to President Obama. I joined the Navy. 4 days in, they said, does anyone want to be a squad leader? And I was an athlete growing up, and I was a team captain. Anyone want to be a squad leader? And I put my hand up. And the guy next to me said, buddy, what are you doing? Don't you know the Navy stands for never again volunteer yourself? You better put your hand down before you get put in charge of something. But sure enough, I was put in charge of a group of about 20 people. And it was, help the person learn their right from their left when somebody's screaming at them. Kind of what it turned out to be. Help them learn how to march and learn how to turn and learn how to make a bunk and fold T-shirts and do all these detail-oriented things. But from that point, throughout the entirety of my career, I was responsible for someone else. And what I have learned in leading, guiding, grooming, creating an environment of growth for people is that trust is crucial.
I found that some of the smartest, most nuanced thinkers I've ever come across in my life were fellow military personnel, officers, and so forth, as we're trying to deal with very complex problems, particularly when we are involved in various, operations in cultures that we're not necessarily familiar with initially, and how you figure out how you're going to make that work requires a lot of, you can't live in black and white. There's a lot of gray, and you have to be able to figure out in the gray. And so I think that may be a perception that some people would find surprising.
And for this next segment is perhaps one of the most difficult, most challenging things that nearly any leader, any manager in any context will struggle with at some point or another, and that is managing conflict, dealing with those difficult relationships, or putting aside the inevitable annoyance that every human will feel at some point. We've got some really insightful thoughts on that and some great practical advice on how to deal with it as well, from guests including Eileen Marcus, Juan Alvarado Jr. again, Philip Blackett, Kat Newport, and some more great insight from Mandy Bowsmith again as well.
Always ask me, Eileen, really, what's the probability that someone's going to annoy me? And this is along the lines of, we're in an interview, what's the probability that my company is going to succeed? What's the probability that this technology will work? What's the probability I'll get into that accelerator? Those kind of questions. I say, the only one I can answer with 100% certainty is annoying. Someone is going to annoy you today. Someone you love, someone you work with, someone on the line for coffee, someone driving in front of you. Someone is going to annoy you. I really didn't understand it for a lot of years, as I think a lot of people don't, because even though we face annoying situations, we don't think about them in terms of business. We don't think about annoying in business. We think about the goal, the metric. We think about sometimes if there are illegal people doing immoral things, but we don't think of people that just get under our skin if they're producing. And yet, annoying is a real showstopper, right? Saps your energy. So I really started to see it when I started coaching. But I go back to that point where I created my first team. The automated finger engine was one part of it. Very high public, very highly, looked at project. And I inherited some of my team and gained them. The people that I hired, I made mini-me's. They were just like me. I vibrate at a high level. I talk fast. I get it done, but I'm a lot to handle. So I had a room full of those people, and I saw it coming at me. And half the time I loved them. They, it was all about, can I have this extra resource? I have an idea. Can you show up to this with me? They weren't, lobbing me bad things, but it was coming at me so fast, and I was overwhelmed, and I was constantly annoyed at them, even though I liked them.
And my relationship with my wife is the best it has ever been because of conflict. But here's a part of the conflict. We were seeking resolution because, again, going back to this, because the person is so much more important, right, than any maybe policy or procedure. In organizations, are policies and procedures important? Absolutely. But who's going to execute those things? People. So we need to be intentional with the people that we do. And conflict is okay. The reason why it's not okay with you is because you're not okay with it. You have to push yourself to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
I can guarantee you, if I got to know you well enough, David, there'd be things that I agree with you on. And there's things that I probably have a disagreement about. Right. And that is okay. But we shouldn't have it in a sense where it's like, believing this lie that to love someone or respect someone, they have to be aligned with us 100% of the issues at hand. And so when I think about people who think differently, people who believe differently, people who vote differently, this is really dealing with relationships with everybody we come across, not just on the political front.
It would be a pretty boring world, wouldn't it, if everyone agreed with everyone all the time? We all had the same point of view on everything. We all shared the same values and priorities. I mean, that'd be a pretty monotonous existence, I reckon.
Well, just imagine too, David, like what if we all, like every one of us loved the same sports team? You would get to the point where you don't have opposing teams. You just have one team playing itself.
Yeah.
Right? Or just playing by itself, maybe. There's no opposition. So it's the thought of what makes things exciting is, there's groups of people that go for certain things, If some people like Mexican food versus, British food, I don't know. I think that's the kind of thing where it's just like one way or the other. If you have a more homogenous society and culture where we all thought the same, to your point, it'd be a very boring world to live in. And it was never designed to be that way in the first place.
Nobody wants to say I'm great at conflict because that feels bad somehow. But at the same time, it's a pretty important skill set, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think managing conflict the right way is one of the most important skills you can have for building relationships. Managing conflict in a healthy and positive way is an investment in a relationship. You're actually putting forth efforts. You're actually putting forth care on the perspectives of other folks, as opposed to mismanaging or having unhealthy conflict, which can lead to relationship breakdown. And when you're looking at that from a leadership perspective, leadership is all about relationships. What relationships can you forge? How healthy are they? Are you moving towards the organizational goals and your personal career goals? So if you look at conflict as a positive source for investment, as opposed to whatever narrative you've carried through your life, and there's so many, whatever, heavy narrative that you've carried through, if you can flip that narrative, you can flip that script, it becomes a more positive thing. And it definitely becomes something that you do want to put forth as a leader.
Most leaders, in my experience, are conflict averse when it comes to their employees. They may be bulldogs when it comes to whatever business they're doing or a business transaction or, getting laws passed in the case of state government or something like that. But when it comes to dealing with their teams, and dealing with employees and personality conflicts, or maybe you've got an employee who has been a rock star and then suddenly is underperforming, they don't know how to deal with it. And part of it is because we don't give them the tools, right? This is this is really an us problem, right? We as an organization and as human resources professionals don't give incoming leaders the tools to really handle those kinds of conflicts. And so what ends up happening is you have a leader who may be a rock star in quote leadership, but they're crap at being a supervisor or a manager. And so their thought is, well, I'll just have HR do it. So they pawn it off onto HR, and HR ends up being the bad guy.
Towards the end of August and beginning of September this year, we did a mini-series on burnout because it's a really important issue that's becoming more widely accepted alongside mental health generally in the workplace. So in this segment, we're going to revisit the key moments from my conversations with Eugene Lee, the burnout recovery coach, with Dr. Frank Douglas again, and with the Chief Burnout Officer, self-described, Michael Levitt.
And I had no experience about how do you deal with burnout. My manager said, take time off work, recharge, you'll be back to normal in 4 weeks. But I had no idea, how do you recover from burnout? Was it rest? Was it yoga? I don't know. It's just a trial and error. And after 4 weeks, of course, I did not recover. I still went back into the burnout cycle and went back to the same old behaviors. It took me about 3.5 years to actually realize what was holding me back. Why was I repeating the same cycle, all the self-sabotaging behaviors? And how do I overcome those? And that took a lot of self-reflection, self-work, kind of getting your self-awareness, talking to myself more kindly, self-compassion, and putting together a self-care routine that actually benefited me.
Burnout is the final thing that happens. I mean, it can be mental, physical, emotional, where you're just simply exhausted. And when that happens, it is not subtle. But even then, depending on the culture you're in, persons may blame the individual who suffered burnout and simply say, they did not know how to manage their job, how to manage the projects that they had, etc.
It's really important for companies to be healthy, because if companies are healthy, they're making better products and services, which you and I consume. We want good stuff. We don't want to be buying garbage or have lousy service. We've all unfortunately experienced that. We want the good stuff, and we're willing to pay for it. But in order to have that happen, those employees in that organization has to be healthy as well. So it's a multi-pronged approach that I take with the ultimate goal of making people and organizations better, because that just benefits all of us. Paraphrase the definition from the World Health Organization, which ICD-11, which is basically a disease. ICD is a disease registry that the World Health Organization manages. So it lists all the diseases on the planet. ICD-11 included burnout. Although they said burnout is not a disease, they classified it as a workplace phenomenon. And what it is basically it's when you have prolonged unaddressed stress due to the constant demands of life. You're overwhelmed, you're fatigued, you're not making good choices in life. You're just not able to keep up with demands of life. So the stress word, you're not burned out unless you have prolonged unaddressed stress. Now, you can have a prolonged period of stress, but if you address it or mitigate it as much as you can, then it prevents burnout. Another question I get a lot, and having experienced both of these, I can tell you my feelings about the situation, because when you describe depression and you describe burnout, all of a sudden you start looking at the ingredients of both and they go, wow, there's a lot of similarities here. What is burnout depression? No, but again, there's a lot of similar symptoms on it. Where I find the biggest difference, and again, I've been clinically depressed and I have been clinically burned out. So I've checked all the boxes on that. The biggest difference is when you are burned out, you still somehow, some way can muster up the energy or bandwidth or muster up whatever you need to get what you need to get done. When you're clinically depressed, oftentimes you can't.
And finally, last segment, a series of clips on one of the biggest recurring themes of leadership itself, something that is featured in nearly every episode of the podcast, I think, in one form or another. It does keep coming up. In the post-pandemic, in the Great Resignation world, this is something that every leader needs to be thinking about, and this is the future of work and the nature of the post-COVID workplace. So we will hear in this segment thoughts and insights of various guests on this topic from the course of this year, including former Olympian Joey Line, reformed lawyer, again in his own words, Paul Glover, the very excellent leadership speaker, Mr. Drew Dudley, leadership and confidence coach, Sabine Gideon, and from a more recent guest, Gordon Schmidt, who you may remember is an academic who spent a lot of time researching the future of work, implications of social media, and so on.
Waking up every morning and seeing another new article about how the Olympics were going to be canceled altogether, and still getting out of bed and with the same intent, getting the work done and training as though they were going to happen, because what if they did? And I wasn't ready. That would have been the biggest regret of my life. And so our team actually came out better. You know, I talked about how oftentimes when we face those challenges, we figure out ways to be even better. When our team walked away from training together, we said, see you in 10 days. And it was 10 months later that we came back together, and we were so much better. Every single person on that roster got so much better during the year delay. It was insane. It was eye-opening. It was mind-blowing how much better we got. And so we did adapt and thrive through that time and figure out how to navigate the gym closures and how to navigate training during that time. And it's a pretty incredible thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, the what ifs they're always interesting, but not always useful, I find. But it does make you wonder, doesn't it? Like, if COVID hadn't happened, maybe that's why you managed to get as far as you did. Maybe you wouldn't have done it otherwise. And yeah, I think that's a nice way of reframing it, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and I think there's quite a lot of businesses as well had a similar kind of experience. Like, it would have been quite a daunting and sudden and unexpected a change over which we had no control. And yeah, I think there's quite a lot of industries even as a whole where actually COVID's turned out to be quite a good thing.
Yes.
Like, a lot of people are quite upset about remote working still, and all the controversial, the return to the office, all of that sort of thing. I don't like calling it return to work because I feel like that's a bit harsh on people. But
yes.
Yeah, but I think there's quite a lot of industries actually, they've saved huge cost by not having to have an office anymore. They've got happier staff, happier workers because they have a better, again, I don't know how I feel about the phrase work-life balance, but it is the phrase, isn't it? That's what everyone understands when you say it. And I do think it can be a competitive advantage now. We'll see how that plays out, I guess, in the next decade or so. But yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it, I think.
Yes.
I believe the pandemic has provided the necessity that transformative event has occurred. And you mentioned it, professionalism. Prior to the pandemic, even though people, by the way, all leaders find the right words, right? You say, I'm going to say the right things, right? Well, that's okay. In 2019, the business community decided that they were going to talk about well-being before the pandemic, right? Because we realized this. The problem was that they realized it, but they weren't going to do anything about it. The pandemic suddenly said, first, workers said, if I'm risking my life to go to work for you, you better realize I have needs and start to provide for those needs. Because this is now reality. Don't talk to me about what it was. I'm risking my life every day I go to work. Isn't that how we looked at it? I mean, oh my God, and by the way, the concept of essential workers was I can't stay at home. Right? If I have a job and I want to get paid, I actually have to risk my life going to work. That's at least 60% of the population. So the reality was the workforce has called leaders out. They said, oh, you said you cared about us. You said you wanted us to be taken care of, well-being. Now let's see you put up or shut up. Well, guess what? we're not as into that as we think we were, right? We love saying the words. Oh my God, we actually have to do things that no. So you mentioned professionalism, and the pandemic has taken that word and said that's not enough. If all you want to be is professional with me, I will not engage with you. Now I may do the work for the money, but if we all talk, leaders want engagement, right? Because that's connected to productivity and profit. You're not going to get it being professional. The pandemic has said to the leader, there now has to be a mix of professionalism and personalism.
We're coming out of a pandemic. We are dealing with an economy that's still recovering. We're dealing with an incredibly divisive political environment in one of the most powerful, important countries in the world. And I think that I can understand why people are looking for a place to let loose. And that perspective, I think a lot pushes what I think is a really important leadership skill for the 21st century, which is empathy. Mm-hmm. And the more I work on my empathy, the less I find myself frustrated. Although I still find myself hurt, but I find myself less likely to lash back out. And I think that to me is a leadership skill that I'm trying very hard to do, is instead of becoming a pass-through for pain and frustration, I'm trying to become a sponge. And then the challenge is, how do you stay healthy while trying to be a sponge for frustration and pain elsewhere? That's why I try to work on what I call the leadership test, this daily accountability tool we developed, because it actually allows me an outlet to deal with this extra pain and frustration that I'm trying to take on so I don't pass it along.
I'd far rather fail at something I want to do than succeed at something I don't, because that success almost traps you then, and you're stuck doing something you don't really want to be doing, but you need the paycheck or you need the client or whatever it is.
Yeah. And at that point too, that success, that external success, right? You're not growing. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's the beauty of life. Like, we get to grow, and you can look at nature, right? Like, the leaves grow, the trees grow, like everything grows. And so if you're in a space where, yeah, you're collecting the paycheck or you're doing the thing and you're making an impact and you're just getting by, but the essence of who you are isn't growing and you aren't expanding, that's so unfortunate. I think as human beings, and if COVID taught us nothing, even though it seems so far removed now, I feel like when COVID first happened, or at least a few months after, it gave people that pause, that moment to question, what do I want? What have I been doing? Like, what is my life? What is real? What are the obligations? And so many people made pivots because they gave themselves that space and that time to really think and assess. So I'm saddened at times when I start to see the trend move back to the busyness and the hustle mentality and the burnout and all the stuff that we hated this time 4 years ago, that like as human beings, we've just naturally gravitated back towards that.
Yeah, I think part of that is when things get a bit tougher, it's almost the default position, isn't it? You feel like I think we all have that sort of ingrained thing from school, I suppose. I don't know, watching our parents, previous generations, that if you work harder, you'll be safer in your career or financially somehow. And I think we lose that kind of sense of what working hard really means. It's that question, isn't it, about, just hours versus productivity, time spent versus output. And yeah, there's a whole thing there, isn't there?
As soon as you said that, I was just like, I think it's the differentiating working hard versus earning a living. We're not synonymous. I know a lot of hard workers that don't make a lot of money, right? And so it's just, but I also know people who are in their zones of genius and they're in their element, and just simply by being in their element, they make a lot of money. So it's finding that balance for you.
There's a whole bunch of different ways we can get something done virtually. It's what's going to work for our particular context or area, and not just make it be like, oh, we're going to have, a virtual avatar for our leader, and that's going to make people motivated. If we got virtual Tupac people will be creative. No, probably not. It's what are the bread and butter things that really help with that. And so that's what a lot of our work looks at. I think the other thing that we talk about related to things like the gig economy and leadership is that a lot of times there isn't designated leaders. We often think about leaders as there's somebody who tells everyone what to do. We all recognize that at the end. But with things like virtual online communities, things like gig work, is Uber drivers in theory aren't supposed to be talking to each other. They only need the app. Well, what we find is if you just use the app, you're more likely to go broke. You're more likely to not be able to make money. Joining online communities on places like Reddit allows you to kind of get trained a little bit on what other drivers are doing. It allows other people to basically act almost as leaders or trainers or mentors to you so that you can succeed. And so some of our papers on the gig economy talk about that, the importance of these bonds with other people, influencing other people, having mentors from these communities.
Well, that's the end of our clip show. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Happy Boxing Day again as well. Because there's so many guests, I can't list all of them and all of their websites in the show notes, unfortunately. However, I have put in the link to the podcast's website. So if you would like to revisit any of those episodes, you can pop along on there. Or you can just find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and search by the guest's name. And I do recommend doing that. If any of these clips have stuck out to you, do go and revisit that full episode, get the full conversation. There's so much more to learn in there. And yeah, that's it from me. I will be back on New Year's Eve with the New Year special. I will talk to you again then. And until then, don't overindulge and be a leader, not a boss.